Every 4 years, the betting markets, the pundits, and the rankings all agree on who's supposed to win the World Cup. And almost every single time, the tournament makes them look wrong. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the format of this specific tournament, 48 teams, 3 co-host countries, wild swings in altitude and climate, and a single elimination bracket with zero margin for error, is practically engineered to take down favorites more than any World Cup before it. If you appreciate this type of content, gently tap that like button. Let's get into it. Start with what favorite actually means, because it's a more fragile label than people treat it as. Going into a World Cup, a handful of teams get tagged as favorites based on FIFA rankings, recent form, squad value, and how they performed in the previous tournament or continental championship. It's a reasonable way to rank teams on paper. It is a terrible way to predict a single elimination tournament. Since 1990, when the field expanded to a more modern, broadly competitive era, the pre-tournament betting favorite has won the World Cup in roughly a third of editions. That means about 2/3 of the time, the team everyone expected to lift the trophy didn't. Brazil in 1998, France in 2002 as defending champions, Spain in 2014, Germany in 2018. All either the favorite or a top-tier contender, all gone before anyone expected. The label favorite describes who's best on average across 90 minutes against everyone. It says almost nothing about who survives 7 specific knockout matches against the run of form. It's worth being precise about why that gap exists, because it's not really about talent at all. It's about sample size. A football match has a relatively low number of goals compared to a sport like basketball, which means a single game carries far more random variance than a full season does. Over a 38-game league campaign, the better team's quality eventually shows up in the table, because the sample is big enough to wash out a bad bounce here or a refereeing mistake there. A World Cup gives a favorite 7 matches total to prove it across an entire tournament, and a single off night in any one of them ends the run completely. Bookmakers and analysts aren't wrong about which teams are better on average. They're just answering a different question than the one a knockout tournament actually asks. Now, layer in the structural problem unique to this tournament. The field itself is bigger and, on average, weaker than any World Cup in history. 2026 expands from 32 teams to 48, which sounds like it should only add more competition for the favorites to worry about. It actually does the opposite in the group stage. More teams means more qualifying slots handed out per continental confederation, which means the average quality of a group stage opponent has dropped compared to 2022. Favorites now spend the group stage facing weaker average opposition than they used to, which sounds like good news until you realize what it actually does. It strips away the tournament minutes that used to toughen contenders up before the real test starts. A favorite that cruises through 3 lopsided group games arrives at the knockout rounds with less recent high-pressure experience than a favorite from a smaller, tighter 32-team field would have had. The group stage used to be a proving ground. In a 48-team format, for the genuine favorites, it's closer to a procedural formality, and that has consequences the moment the knockout rounds start asking real questions. The new round of 32 makes this worse in a way that's specific to 2026's bracket design. Instead of the top 2 teams from each group automatically advancing like every previous tournament, this format also pulls in 8 of the best-performing third-place finishers and seeds them into the knockout bracket based on how they performed in the group stage. A favorite that finishes second in its own group, maybe after dropping points in a match it should have won comfortably, can suddenly find itself drawn against a sharp, in-form third-place qualifier instead of the comfortable group winner it might have expected to face. The extra round also means favorites now have to win 1 more knockout match than they did in any 32-team tournament just to reach the final. An additional 90 minutes or more of single elimination risk stacked on top of everything else already working against them. Then there's the part of this specific tournament that no previous World Cup favorite ever had to plan around. 3 co-host countries spread across a continent's worth of climates. The United States, Mexico, and Canada are hosting together, which means the host cities span roughly 4,300 kilometers east to west. Compare that to Qatar in 2022, where the furthest 2 stadiums were about 50 miles apart, and every match was played in essentially the same climate-controlled conditions. In 2026, a team can play 1 match in humid heat near the Gulf Coast, and days later play another match more than 2,000 meters above sea level in Mexico City. Especially European and South American teams, built around a possession-heavy, high-pressing style, are the ones with the furthest adjustment to make, because that style depends on consistent fitness output across 90 minutes in conditions their domestic leagues never replicate. A heavily favored team that's used to playing in 15-degree weather in Manchester or Munich doesn't get a practice run for what 35-degree wet bulb heat does to a high press in the 70th minute. The underdogs, by contrast, often include teams from confederations already used to heat, humidity, or altitude as a baseline, which narrows the gap between best team on paper and team that can physically execute its game plan on the day. Altitude deserves its own moment here because of how specifically it punishes the exact style that makes a team a favorite in the first place. Matches in Mexico City sit at roughly 2,240 meters above sea level, and Guadalajara sits around 1,566 meters. Studies on altitude's effect on football performance show reductions in total distance covered of roughly 3 to 9%, and a drop in high-velocity running of as much as 21%. Now think about which teams rely most heavily on exactly those 2 metrics: total distance covered and repeated high-velocity sprints. It's almost always the technically gifted, possession-dominant favorites, the teams whose entire identity is built on outrunning and outpressing opponents for 90 straight minutes. A counter-attacking underdog that sits deep, defends in a low block, and looks to spring forward in quick bursts loses far less of its game plan to altitude than a favorite that needs to control tempo through constant movement. The format doesn't just add altitude as a random variable, it adds altitude as a variable that disproportionately strips away the exact tools that make a favorite dangerous. And underneath all of that sits the most basic mathematical reality of the entire tournament. Single elimination doesn't reward the best team. It rewards the team that's best on one specific day, 7 times in a row, with 0 room for an off night. A league season averages out randomness over 30-plus matches. A knockout World Cup compresses everything into 1 bad half, 1 red card, 1 goalkeeping mistake, 1 missed penalty. And the better team on paper goes home, regardless of how dominant they were for the previous 89 minutes. This is exactly why penalty shootouts feel so cruel and so decisive at the same time. They're a coin flip mechanism deciding outcomes for teams that, over 120 minutes, were genuinely even. The format itself has no mechanism for correcting a fluke result. There's no second leg, no aggregate score over 2 matches like in club competition. 1 knockout match, 1 outcome, and an entire tournament's worth of being the best team for 4 years can evaporate in extra time against a side ranked 40 spots lower. History backs this up with some genuinely brutal examples. Spain arrived at the 2014 World Cup as the defending champions, the team that had just won 3 straight major tournaments: Euro 2008, the 2010 World Cup, and Euro 2012, a run unmatched in the sport's modern history. They lost their opening match 5-1 to the Netherlands and were eliminated after just 2 group games, the fastest collapse of a defending champion in the tournament's modern era. Germany went into 2018 as the reigning champions from 2014, ranked first in the world, and went home after the group stage for the first time since 1938, including a group stage loss to South Korea, a team ranked 57th in the world at the time. Brazil hosted in 2014 as one of the heaviest favorites of the entire tournament, and lost 7-1 to Germany in the semifinal, on home soil, in front of their own fans, a result still referenced as one of the most shocking in the sport's history. And the original blueprint for this exact pattern goes all the way back to 1950, when host nation Brazil needed only a draw in the deciding match and lost to Uruguay in front of an estimated 200,000 people at the Maracanã, the result still known in Brazil as the Maracanazo. Favorites collapsing isn't a quirk of modern football. It's close to a recurring theme of the entire tournament's history. And 2026's format adds more variables that make it more likely, not less. There's another piece of this that gets less attention. The expanded qualifying system means dangerous underdogs are arriving better prepared than ever before. With 48 total spots instead of 32, confederations that used to send only their 2 or 3 strongest teams now send 4, 5, sometimes 6. That means the teams squeezing into those extra slots aren't always the weakest available. Sometimes they're genuinely talented teams that simply got unlucky in a brutal qualifying group in a smaller field, and now get a path into the tournament they wouldn't have had before. A bigger field doesn't just dilute the bottom of the bracket with weaker teams. It also widens the door for teams that are underrated specifically because their confederation is underrated. The exact profile of side that has historically pulled off the tournament's biggest shocks. More entry points means more chances for a genuinely dangerous team to slip into the bracket disguised as a low seed. And favorites drawn against one of those teams in an early knockout round often don't see the danger coming until it's too late. This is exactly the mechanism behind some of the tournament's most famous shocks, and an expanded field only increases how often the conditions for one can occur. Senegal beat defending champions France in the opening match of 2002. South Korea, co-hosting in 2002, ran all the way to the semifinals as a side nobody outside their own confederation rated before the tournament. Saudi Arabia beat Argentina in the opening match of 2022, and Argentina went on to win the whole thing anyway, which is its own reminder that even the eventual champion usually survives at least one match it had no business losing on paper. Morocco reached the semifinals in 2022, the first African nation ever to do so, by beating Spain and Portugal back-to-back in the knockout rounds. None of those results happened because the favorite was secretly bad. They happened because a knockout format, stacked with this much variance, eventually produces exactly the kind of outcome probability says should be rare but not impossible. And a 48-team field, with more confederations sending more teams, simply increases the number of rolls of the dice. Then there's fatigue and squad depth, which matters more in this tournament than any before it because of the travel demands layered on top of an already long competition. Favorites tend to be built around star players from Europe's biggest leagues, players who've just finished a grueling 50-plus match domestic season before reporting for national duty. Add in border crossings that can take 2 to 4 hours between certain venues, time zone shifts, and the heat and altitude differences already covered, and the cumulative physical toll on a favorite's most important players compounds match after match in a way it simply didn't in single-climate, single-host tournaments. A favorite with a shallow bench has historically been able to lean on its best players for all 7 matches and get away with it. In a tournament this physically demanding, that approach runs out of road by the quarterfinals, exactly when the matches matter most, and exactly when fatigue-related mistakes are most costly. The depth problem cuts even deeper than just tired legs, because of how international squads are actually built. A club team can rotate its entire roster across a 38-game season and rebuild form gradually. A national team gets a 26-man squad, a handful of warm-up friendlies, and then 7 matches where every single injury to a key starter has to be absorbed by whoever's left on the bench. Often a player from a smaller league with far less big match experience. Favorites with 1 or 2 truly elite, hard-to-replace players are one knock to the hamstring away from losing the exact thing that made them a favorite in the first place. The deeper, more physically resilient squads, the ones that don't collapse when their best player goes down, are built for exactly this kind of attrition. And that's part of why depth tends to outlast star power once the tournament reaches its final, most demanding stretch. There's also a layer of variance favorites can't train for or plan around at all. Officiating. VAR has reduced some of the most obvious referee errors, but it hasn't eliminated subjective calls, handballs, penalty decisions, red cards for last-man fouls, and a single contentious call in a knockout match can swing a result that statistically should have gone the other way. Favorites with a reputation for dominant possession often draw more contact in the penalty area simply because they're attacking more, which means more 50-50 decisions land on their match specifically. A marginal VAR review that goes against a heavy favorite in the 85th minute of a tied knockout match doesn't care about FIFA rankings or squad value. It's one more variable in a tournament already stacked with them, and it's one that pure quality has no way of insulating against. There's also a psychological trap that tends to catch the most talent-loaded favorites specifically, having so much individual quality that the team never settles on one identity. A so-called golden generation, a squad packed with multiple world-class attackers all expected to start, often spends a tournament shuffling its best 11 and tactical shape match to match, trying to fit egos and reputations rather than committing to one repeatable game plan. Underdog squads rarely have this problem because they usually don't have the embarrassment of riches to manage in the first place. Their best 11 and their game plan are obvious from match 1, and they execute the same identity all tournament long. Belgium's so-called golden generation across 2014 through 2022 is the textbook case. Enormous individual talent, a so-so quarterfinal to semifinal ceiling, and never a trophy to match the hype. More talent sounds like it should only help a favorite. It sometimes means more ways for the team to be less than the sum of its parts. So if the favorites keep finding ways to lose, who actually wins? The pattern across World Cup history points toward teams with a specific profile. Tactically disciplined, defensively organized, capable of grinding out 1-0 results rather than needing to dominate possession, and built with a deep, physically resilient squad rather than a roster overloaded with attacking talent and thin everywhere else. Teams like that don't need to control every match. They need to survive 7 of them. In a tournament with this many variables working against the favorites, heat, altitude, travel, an expanded and unpredictable qualifying pool, and the brutal randomness of single elimination, survival, not dominance, is what actually tends to lift the trophy. That's really the core of it. Being the best team on paper has never guaranteed anything at a World Cup, and 2026's specific combination of format, geography, and bracket structure stacks even more obstacles in front of the favorites than usual. The teams everyone expects to win in the run-up to the tournament are walking into the most physically and structurally unforgiving version of this event the sport has ever staged. None of this means the favorites can't win. It means the margin for error they're operating under is thinner than it's ever been at a World Cup. A team that's genuinely the best in the world still has every tool it needs to lift the trophy. Elite talent, modern sports science, deep pools of resources most underdogs simply don't have access to. But best in the world on average, and best on 7 specific days across 3 countries, multiple altitudes, and an expanded bracket with 1 extra round of pure knockout risk are 2 different propositions, and 2026 is testing that gap harder than any tournament before it. The favorites who do go all the way this summer won't be the ones who were simply the most talented on paper in the build-up. They'll be the ones who adapted fastest to everything this specific format throws at them, and got lucky enough not to run into one bad night against a dangerous underdog at the wrong moment. Keep all of that in mind the next time a pundit confidently names the team that's obviously going to win it all in 2026. They might be right about who's best. They're answering a much easier question and the one this tournament is actually going to ask. And if you want to understand exactly how the bracket those favorites have to survive actually gets built, who plays who, and why one bad group stage result can completely change a contender's path to the final, I made a video on exactly that. You can check it out by clicking right here.